Policy Studies webinar. My name is Eamon Ives. I'll be chairing today's discussion, which will all be about the future of Britain's energy policy. And as that's what I focus a lot of my research on, perhaps I would say this, but I think there are a few things that are more critical and important than ensuring our modern economy has the access it needs to the energy it needs. Add in the whole sort of climate question, and we begin to realise just how important it is that we have an energy policy which is fit for purpose and fit for the 21st century. So no pressure for my guests who are joining me today. But before starting, just some quick housekeeping. So we will be taking questions from the audience at the end of this webinar. So do please start submitting them now. If you have any, you can do this using the Q&A function here or by tweeting at CPS Think Tank, and we'll pick them up there. So I'm keen to get in as many questions as possible. So without further ado, I'm delighted to introduce our speakers for today. First up, we have Anne-Marie Trevelyan, MP, who is the Minister for Business, Energy and Clean Growth. She's also involved with the UK's COP26 delegation, COP26 being the conference that the UK will be hosting in November in Glasgow. So I'm sure we'll want to touch on that as well later on. So Minister, floor is yours.
Eamon, thank you very much indeed. And it's lovely to be able to join you this morning. So thank you so much for including me. I think just in a couple of minutes, I wanted to reflect on the first 2 months that I've been in this role, having arrived after the publication of the Prime Minister's 10-point plan in November of last year, and then indeed the Energy White Paper, the more fulsome iteration of that thinking in December. I think the 10-point plan is an incredibly powerful tool to help us understand, exactly as you say, the complexity and the multiplicity of the layers that we've got to deal with and take on to change in order to help us to deliver a new and net zero world that we're all going to live in. The Energy White Paper is the starting point of how we deliver that. And it's a huge task. I don't think we should underestimate the challenge we've set ourselves, nor indeed the pace at which we are planning to do it. We are genuinely world leading in that, not only in how we've come this far, you know, the 10-year shift from our coal usage from something like 40% down to 2% in our energy outputs in the last 10 years, a huge effort as we've been able to build a renewables sector from scratch. But I think what's really important as part of this is that we've got to take the public with us. There's got to be an understanding of what it is we're doing, why we're doing it, and it's critically important that our energy policy, as we move through the various stages to net zero by 2050, that it creates a fair deal for consumers and that everybody is part of that journey. But it comes in strands. I describe this a bit like a Rubik's cube. You can't just do one side. It's only complete when you've done all 6 sides. You can't take a piece out and turn it around because somehow that will make it easier. We've got to do everything symbiotically to get to the new net zero world that we want to and need to live in. But we are, this year is a very busy year from the Energy White Paper. We've published last week the Industrial Decarbonisation Strategy. It's the first strategy published by a major economy to set out how our heavy industry will be moving to decarbonisation in line with net zero, but importantly, whilst remaining competitive and indeed without just pushing our emissions abroad. So there's a huge piece of work in there, not only in terms of financing and structures, but the technologies which are still, developing and helping those steps to progress in each of the sectors. So that's a really important kind of starting point for our industries. We've also got heat and buildings strategy coming out imminently. I wouldn't dare give a specific date, but very, very shortly. And also a hydrogen strategy. So there we're again world leading, critical that we set that on the right path. We're going to be looking at blue and green hydrogen together so that we can help develop the wider technologies and uses of hydrogen as we move towards being able to create green hydrogen energy. And that's really important. We're one of the few major countries doing it that way, but I think it will give us both economic benefit, but also the opportunity to make sure we maximize the use of hydrogen. And then these will all, if you like, come together. Not sure if that's quite the right word, but in ahead of COP in the autumn, we'll publish a net zero strategy, which will look at this in the round, drawing together, if you like, the step challenges that we've created by having an extraordinarily effective governance system through the Climate Change Committee and their carbon budgets, which are helping us move through to a net zero position. So we've got a very busy year ahead of us as we really start to drive that delivery framework to help all those parts from industry through to you and me as we change how we live our lives to that net zero challenge. So there's plenty for us to be getting on with. Thanks, Eamon.
Absolutely, absolutely. Thank you, and lots to pick up on there. But next up, we have Kirsty Gogan. Kirsty's a co-founder and executive director of Energy for Humanity, which describes itself as a community of pro-nuclear environmental activists based in the UK and Switzerland. She's a leading expert on nuclear energy, and I'm very interested to hear her thoughts on what role nuclear has to play going forward in Britain's energy system. So Kirsty, over to you.
Oh, thank you. Thanks so much. Yeah, pleasure to be here. And you know, I love the framing here, and it's incredibly important this year, particularly as the UK is obviously hosting COP26. And the UK has shown incredible leadership, actually, having made, you know, the largest overall reduction in emissions of any country in Europe over a 5-year period. And, you know, that impressive achievement is largely thanks to, of course, maintaining our existing nuclear fleet whilst also building a lot of renewable energy generation. You know, that combination of nuclear and renewables is really the only proven real world way to fully decarbonize the electricity grids. We see other countries that are phasing out nuclear energy, locking in dependence in coal and gas, you know, undermining their efforts, unfortunately, to decarbonize their electricity grids. So I want to sort of focus on the metrics really that matter, because you know, I think we tend to focus on targets for certain technology build outs rather than the outcomes that we care about. Of course, carbon intensity ultimately of the electricity grid, but then our broader ambitions around net zero and the efforts there to decarbonize the more challenging sectors of heat and transport and industry in particular. And the role potentially that nuclear energy could play in helping us achieve that very fast, at scale, and very cost effectively as well. It's instructive actually to consider how other countries have been able to, you know, build out clean electricity generation. The world record for the fastest build out of clean electricity generation per capita is Norway, with its hydroelectricity construction, followed by Sweden's nuclear build out. And in fact, the top 12 fastest build outs have been hydro and nuclear, which is a bit surprising given, you know, they take a long time to build these capital intensive infrastructure projects, but the sheer amount of energy that they produce when they're running outweighs the relatively long build times. Now we've seen the last decade achieve, you know, wind and solar generation into really affordable technologies that can make really major contributions to the decarbonisation of electricity. And there's plenty of evidence to tell us that, you know, after having made a major investment in the first of a kind, first in a generation nuclear project in the UK, that we'll start to see really significant cost reduction in nuclear energy in the UK as well. And that, you know, I'm sure we'll hear more about that from Julia, the programmatic approach where you've established skills and capability within the supply chain and licensed your design, qualified your supply chain, then you just, you know, don't have to make that investment again. But beyond electricity, nuclear technologies are really well suited to the production also of a broader range of energy services, such as heat and hydrogen, and indeed flexible generation to support high penetrations of variable renewables. Because nuclear technologies, when they're built really cost effectively, can make very low cost electricity and heat, that makes them super efficient in the production of hydrogen production. And our analysis, the Missing Link report, shows that just 10 refinery scale gigafactories producing hydrogen in the UK could entirely replace the UK's oil and gas consumption with hydrogen produced by 2030 for less than $1 a kilogram, which is the kind of the magic number for, you know, competitive hydrogen. And then in addition to that, the production of heat, and even the potential to repower existing coal plants and repurpose existing infrastructure with a very, very small environmental footprint, not only contributes towards a faster transition to clean energy, but also de-risks the overall clean energy transition, which is incredibly important, as the Minister was saying, with regards to public acceptability and just the sheer scale of infrastructure build that's going to be required for us to achieve that. So finally, I would just say that I really hope to see that nuclear energy will be given a platform that is proportionate and equivalent to the contribution that it makes towards decarbonisation in the world's electricity grids today, and its potential contribution towards full decarbonisation of the energy system globally at COP26. Unfortunately, nuclear energy hasn't been given a platform at previous COP events, and I'm sure the UK, being a leader and pragmatic and committed to outcomes, will see that changes, and that we send a signal to the world that we're serious about tackling climate change. Thank you.
Thank you, Kirsty. Yeah, certainly lots to unpack there. And we know that nuclear sort of divides opinion. So if there's anyone watching who loves nuclear or who hates nuclear, do get your questions in and we can get them answered. So we'll now turn to our third speaker, Rachel Morrison. Rachel is a reporter for Bloomberg, where she covers energy, utilities and climate. So Rachel, please can you give us your opening remarks? Sorry, Rachel, I think you're muted.
There we go. Is that better?
Yeah.
Okay, excellent. I was just saying that I think it's a really interesting time for energy policy. At the end of last year, we really had an avalanche of papers. We had the 10-point plan, the energy white paper, and investors, the thing you hear most is that they want clarity and they want certainty. And the problem is, even when they get some, it's never enough. So we have some way markers, but there's still lots to be figured out. And it was good to hear the Minister setting out some of what we can expect for the rest of the year. So I thought I'd set out a few of the things that I hear people asking and talking about, and first have to be hydrogen. So we're waiting for the hydrogen strategy, which I think people are really hoping will contain some details about subsidies. And there's a tremendous buzz around hydrogen, and in pretty much all conversations I have with people, it's mentioned at some point. So there's no shortage of interest, but how to bring down the costs and get it to scale are the challenges that industry, I think, are hoping will be addressed in that policy paper. And in terms of nuclear, we're obviously in good company here today, and perhaps maybe we can hear a little bit from Julia and the Minister about how talks are going on financing for Sizewell C. It's a view held beyond just the nuclear industry that net zero is very hard, if not impossible, without nuclear. And in the white paper, the government made clear that it was going to support Sizewell and one more large-scale project. So it'll be interesting to see which projects become the realistic contenders for that. And also small modular reactors are an interesting part of the puzzle. There's been some funding here and there, but nothing major. And I know it's an area there's a lot of interest from investors in the US as well as in Britain. And then lastly, offshore wind is clearly key strategic importance to the UK and an area where we are world leading. We have the target of 40 gigawatts by 2030. And now the difficult bit begins of figuring out how to get the electricity from where it's produced to where it's going to be consumed and making sure it doesn't cost too much. And offshore wind has been a key area for deals where we've seen a really interesting dynamic of the oil companies like BP and Total moving in on what's traditionally been the business of utilities and sector-specific developers with some mixed success, I think it's fair to say. So I think I'll leave it there now, and we can hand back to Eamon and wait for the discussion.
Thank you, Rachel. So yes, you mentioned Julia. So Julia, our final speaker. Julia Pike is the Director of Financing and Economic Regulation at Sizewell C, the nuclear power station which EDF hope to develop in Suffolk. So Julia, can you give us your thoughts on where you see the current state of play in energy policy today?
Thanks, Eamon. And I think the first thing I should say is that I think the CPS Bridging the Gap report is a very important piece of work in the net zero context. And a point which hasn't yet been discussed in the talk so far is security of supply. I think your report concluded that security of supply for the UK would be at risk without the development of new nuclear. And so we were particularly pleased to see the very welcome commitment to nuclear in both the Energy White Paper and in the Prime Minister's 10-point plan. So sometimes, I mean, I think it's decreasing, but sometimes nuclear is portrayed as being in competition with renewables, which, as Rachel said, offshore wind's been fantastically successful in the UK. I mean, it absolutely isn't. I think nuclear is complementary to renewables, and it's going to provide the baseload and weather independence, which will actually enable the huge expansion that we all foresee for the offshore wind industry here. So if we focus on what we want Sizewell in particular to show, we want Sizewell to show that when you copy an existing design, when you've done all the hard yards in getting a design through the UK regulator, who rightly has some of the highest standards for safety in the world, and you've got an experienced supply chain, you can bring down the cost of constructing nuclear. So we're very keen to show that. We're very keen to continue to build on our UK content. So Hinkley has 64% UK content. Sizewell will have 70 or greater in the construction period. And if, as we're hoping to do, we can get the nuclear fuel made in the UK, then in operations, it will be really high UK content, or even higher, sort of in the high 90s. UK skills, Hinkley has revived an awful lot of UK skills for nuclear, but also more widely for the whole of the green construction that we'll need. Skills like welding, steel fixing, these are actually common skills. And I think that the more that we can work together across all green industries to have common skill standards, common training, the better that's going to be for people. Which of course brings me on to jobs. We're hoping that Sizewell will support up to 70,000 UK jobs, which of course are going to be really important following the pandemic. A unique feature of Sizewell in the UK nuclear industry to date is that we actually intend to take out some of the heat before it makes electricity. So we're going to be able to use this clean, low carbon heat, which is a very valuable commodity. And with that heat, we are hoping from Sizewell C to make heat assisted hydrogen, which is thought to be up to around 10% more efficient than electricity only electrolysis. And we are also exploring the use of that heat for district heating, but also for direct air capture, where working with partners at Nottingham University and Strata, there's a technology identified which can actually be powered by heat at the sort of temperature Sizewell will produce. So, you know, as Rachel said, lots of talk about hydrogen. With Sizewell, we can actually get hydrogen going in the east of England, working with our partners in the Freeport East, which successfully bid in for Freeport status. Because one of the things that's difficult to do with hydrogen is to marry up demand and supply. So we can both make hydrogen using Sizewell B, which of course is sitting there making around about 3% of the UK's electricity at the moment, low carbon electricity. And we are intending to use low carbon vehicles as they become available in the construction of Sizewell C, so hydrogen buses, hydrogen forklifts, and the other form of hydrogen vehicle which is commercially available is actually port vehicles. So it makes great sense to link up with the ports and together explore how hydrogen or possibly ammonia can become the clean maritime fuel of choice and make a real success out of the hydrogen economy in the east of England. So I think I'll stop there so we leave plenty of room for questions.
Thank you, Julie. Yes, always good to have that time. And one thing to mention here is that unfortunately the Minister will need to be leaving us at 11, so I'm conscious to get some questions in quickly to her off the bat of all these. So on that note, Minister, I think one thing you said was that it's critical that we kind of have a fair deal for consumers, that we take the public with us on this sort of whole green transition, particularly with the energy sector and what that might mean for transport, for heating and things like that. So yeah, in a word, you know, how do you think the UK can facilitate that? Because I think one thing as we sort of see further decarbonisation measures coming in that need to come in the next decade or so. You know, how do we ensure that then those costs are not just going to be placed on consumers who might not be able to react to them as we might hope? Do you have anything to say to that?
Thanks, Eamon. I think it's a critical part of making sure that we are able to do this, and indeed that we have the support of all our constituencies as we do that. So we're really committed to getting the right reform structure so that we will both protect the interests of consumers on the journey and create opportunities to reduce bills alongside carbon emissions. So the Energy White Paper sets out a framework on that in terms of protecting the fuel poor and providing opportunities to save money on bills, whilst thinking about the questions of, you know, efficiency, so warmer homes, and thinking about how we play our part to do that. So we've got consultation on creating the framework to introduce opt-in switching, considering how the current kind of auto renewal and roll-off tariff arrangements could be reformed to get greater competition. I think the heart of this for me is enabling and encouraging behaviour change that makes sure citizens have, you know, the best possible value for money, whilst we're also driving at a bigger picture level the transition to a low carbon position. I completely agree with the points made that I don't think renewables and nuclear are in competition at all. We need to have that solid nuclear base load, and indeed the opportunities that it may afford for a wider participation in health. But we need to make sure that we do all those things whilst ensuring the retail market regulatory framework adequately covers that wider market. So we'll be consulting later in the spring on how to regulate third parties and make sure that we give the consumer a critical part in the net zero journey.
Thank you. Yeah, and sort of to follow up on that, that was obviously sort of looking at the consumer side of things. One other thing you mentioned was that it's of importance that the UK remains competitive, and you mentioned sort of the idea of carbon leakage. That if we you know, take certain measures, would that lead to manufacturing or production going elsewhere and not really having a meaningful impact on global emissions, which is obviously the important thing here. How do you think we can ensure that we do that in the UK and that we stay competitive whilst also decarbonising?
So I think there, interestingly, referring, as you did earlier, to COP26, this is absolutely part of the international conversation that we must have, and we have an important leadership role this year, holding the presidency for COP26, to really push that forward. That the understanding that it's, you know, it's not going to be acceptable to consumers, quite rightly, to allow carbon leakage in the longer term. So we need to get to grips with the valuing of, you know, carbon across the board. The Treasury are doing a lot of work on that at the moment, and I think it's an important part of this whole conversation. And again, bringing citizens with it, but we can't, you know, we're not going to unilaterally find a solution that works. This has to be done on an international basis with leadership from the UK to drive that commitment, because, you know, net zero means understanding all of our carbon emissions and indeed, you know, how we use carbon and how we value it. So there's a big piece of work still to do there, but we are seeing a lot of movement in thinking about it and working out what useful tools might be. We're legislating for the work from Mark Carney done or in terms of big corporates starting to think about this, and I think we are leading in every level that we can to drive that thinking and shifting the way people behave on it. But there's a lot of work to do in that space, and it's really important that we lead on it.
Thank you, that's great to hear. And I'll also take this moment to plug some future work that the CPS will hopefully be doing on this, so keep your eyes peeled for that. I want to bring in the rest of the panelists now, and Kirsty, perhaps one thing you mentioned which really kind of pricked my ears was you know, the importance of focusing on outcomes rather than the inputs of what we do, and so maybe you could give a bit more you know, thoughts around that. And obviously the government's got its own targets for certain amounts of offshore wind, for instance. What do you see, and what are your thoughts kind of around those targets?
Well, I mean, we have just an eye-wateringly ambitious challenge ahead of us to achieve full net zero within 29 years. And, you know, I think one of the important principles that we need to take into account here is, you know, the public acceptability piece, which the minister's also mentioned as a critical factor in achieving success. It's actually a critical risk, we think, to the transition. And so finding ways to repurpose as much existing infrastructure as possible, to reduce the overall build that's required in our electricity system. And we know that a combination of firm, clean, dispatchable power that can be provided very well with nuclear energy will reduce the overall investment required in achieving clean, affordable, reliable electricity. But beyond that, we also then need to find ways of, you know, very efficiently and very cost effectively producing very large amounts of hydrogen that is cheap enough to be used as a clean synthetic drop-in fuel. Our analysis shows that if hydrogen can be produced at a large enough scale and a low enough cost, then it can be used in synthetic hydrocarbons in aviation, for example. And that means that we don't have to ask people to make a choice between flying less and achieving net zero. Those are the kinds of choices actually that ultimately are going to make a big difference at the end.
And obviously hydrogen really has been the buzzword, at least for the last kind of 18 months or so, and CPS itself has done some work on that, particularly looking at sort of hydrogen in the transport sector. Rachel, you mentioned hydrogen as well, and we've got the hydrogen strategy, which the minister alluded to, coming out hopefully quite soon. I don't know if you want to expand on that, and maybe put a question to the minister yourself, you know, about sort of subsidies that we might be seeing.
Yes, I think that when it comes to subsidising hydrogen, people tend to point to offshore wind as a successful example of bringing down the costs of a technology. And there's a lot of kind of thinking about what a subsidy might look like for hydrogen. So I'd be interested to hear whether the same kind of framework might be considered, or whether it would be something quite different. I think it's important. It's a very important question for investors at the minute.
And another thing you mentioned, the SMR technology, so small modular reactors. How do you sort of see, how bullish are you on them? Do you see a future for them in the UK? And you know, maybe is there anything that you think the UK needs to be doing right now to sort of expedite their progress?
I think when we look at what's coming out of BEIS, there's a lot of support for SMRs. That we keep hearing that they are seen as part of the future and that the UK wants them, but we haven't seen a huge chunk of funding. At one point we heard that this was on the cards, but nothing materialized. So we've seen a few small bits of funding, and Rolls-Royce is kind of the main project that seems to be kind of nearest to getting off the ground. But I know that there are other investors and other parties interested in developing this technology. So I think it's quite a critical time where, if we want to have it, then the government needs to make something quite clear to the industry, to a signal or some funding to say we're really serious about wanting this as part of the mix.
Julia, I wonder if you can kind of segue on from that. You obviously talked about kind of skills that are going to be so necessary to developing future nuclear sites. You know, are they absolutely critical that we have those in place for sort of the SMRs when they're ready to come online?
Well, I think that you know, generally speaking, the construction industry in the UK needs to improve its productivity, and that's a sort of generally acknowledged fact. And so that's across any technology, whether or not it's small modular reactors or wind turbines or anything else that we're building. In terms of nuclear skills, yes, absolutely. I mean, you know, the SMRs, which I'm sure will be a very welcome addition to nuclear technology in the UK, they will be subject to nuclear site licensing and similar operating regimes to gigawatt reactors. So yes, absolutely. Having a live industry with people moving through training, going through their careers is very important, whatever form of nuclear we're looking to build, yeah.
And sort of coming back to the nuclear heat point as well, I think, you know, often people maybe conceptualize nuclear as being all about electricity, and they don't quite understand how its other applications can be used. Maybe just for the people who are watching, can you kind of expand a little bit and talk us through, exactly how it can be used to make sort of renewable hydrogen or decarbonize heat in industry and maybe domestic settings as well?
Yeah, sure. So if we start with Sizewell B, the principal component of green hydrogen is low carbon electricity. And so currently electrolyzers are quite capital intensive. If you're going to spend money on electrolyzers, you want to run them 24/7, whatever the weather. And so having a constant source of electricity like nuclear alongside renewables going into electrolyzers just makes sense for everybody. And then what you can do with heat, if I come on to how do you take out the heat? So in the UK, nuclear power stations have not produced heat as well as electricity. They've used all of their heat or a proportion of their heat to make electricity, and the rest of the heat has been cooled and put back in the sea. That's just the way the UK has previously commissioned nuclear. In colder countries, nuclear has been used for a long time to produce heat as well as to produce electricity, and it's been used for big district heating schemes. Sometimes the heat's pumped up to 80 kilometres away from the station. And that really is just a question of economics. How far is it economic to pipe heat? So what we're going to do with Sizewell C is recognising the value of clean, low-carbon heat in a decarbonising world in which the use of unabated gas is no longer going to be acceptable. Then we can basically extract heat, clean steam. There's nothing nuclear about it. There's clean steam before it hits the turbines. So you make marginally less electricity, and you can take out an amount of heat which doesn't really disturb the amount of electricity produced. That's probably what we'll do at Sizewell. So it's about 400 megawatt thermal, unless we want to make a new safety case to take out more heat, which we can do and definitely would do. If we were to build a third UK EPR, we would make the safety case to take out a lot more heat and have a much greater arbitrage between heat and electricity. So with the heat, we would hope to use it to heat industry. So any industry which needs heat in its processes. It's great news that Sizewell will be within the Freeport area. So we'll be able to provide heat to any industry which needs the heat. With heat-assisted hydrogen, we're following a project in Germany, which is using a different technique called solid oxide electrolyzer cell. With the sort of heat we can make, that we think that's going to make hydrogen around about 10% cheaper than electricity only. And we are looking at direct air capture. So currently, direct air capture, which is essentially sucking carbon out of the air with huge fans and pushing it through a solvent which takes out the carbon, that's very expensive. It's very energy intensive. But with our partners, we are looking at a technology which is very, very, very considerably cheaper because it uses effectively waste heat rather than electricity. And so that's really exciting and would make the power station carbon negative.
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, we could certainly talk about direct air capture later on. One thing I'd like to pivot to is, and it's kind of a question we've had from the audience, essentially around the idea that if wind and solar PV are going to be contributing a lot more of our energy going forwards, is there a risk that we would sort of build in excess supply? And then does that kind of change the sorts of nuclear power stations which we're developing? Kirsty, you mentioned the words load following, and I don't know whether you kind of want to just let the audience know exactly what that means, and then give your thoughts on sort of the whole concept of the question at its heart.
Yeah, sure. Well, load following is essentially, providing a sort of stable supply of electricity, and electricity is very expensive to store. So ideally, you want to produce it almost exactly at the moment when it's used. And when you have a lot of variable renewables, wind and solar on your system, that means that you need something that's dispatchable, that you can switch on to complement those sources. And we've actually done a really substantial study in the United States for ARPA-E, for the arm of the US Department of Energy, looking at 4 major independent system operators in the US, and the potential contribution that advanced nuclear could play when it's combined with thermal energy storage. So what we found was that that, of course, nuclear energy is already flexible. You can ramp it up and down, but it's not economical to do so because nuclear plants like to run at more than 90% of their capacity. But if you can essentially be running your nuclear plant all the time and either charging your thermal heat source battery, your thermal energy storage, or supplying directly to the grid, that becomes extremely economical, because it means that you can have 2 turbines. You can be then dispatching from your massive battery, or indeed directly from the plant into the grid as it's needed, enabling that load following capacity, clean dispatchable generation that acts a bit like a gas plant does today. So that we rely a lot on gas at the moment to be able to ramp up and down. Big nuclear plants could do this, or indeed smaller plants are being developed by, for example, Bill Gates. His company, which has just received a huge grant from the US government, Natrium, is designed with exactly this configuration of thermal energy storage to enable it to become a clean dispatchable plant. Very, very cheap, very economical, ultimately competing with gas plants, but without the emissions.
Excellent. Hopefully that answers our audience. So this question, Rachel, I'd like to just kind of turn to you and zoom out a little bit. Something we've talked about a lot through this discussion is obviously the impact that the energy transition is going to have for consumers. So I think a lot of people kind of predicting a massive electrification of different parts of the economy, whether that's transport, heating. Obviously, our electricity supply still needs to decarbonize a lot as well. Can I just kind of ask your basic opinions on how palatable that's going to be? Are there going to be any sort of bumps in the road to come, and how might sort of political parties adapt and respond to that?
Yeah, I think it's an interesting question that we've sort of touched on a little bit, about bringing the public with you when you're kind of designing these policies. And one of the places it's easiest perhaps to see it is electric vehicles. I mean, they have been talked about for so long, and finally we're seeing the kind of push from the industry and people coming along with that. But the first thing that they say is they cost a lot, and the charging has to be got right to incentivize people to charge, a bit like we were just talking about, when there's lots of renewable supply, and making sure they're incentivized to do that, and getting that right does provide potentially a huge amount of storage in 10 million EVs. If you get those connected at the right time, then you might not need the huge giga batteries and things that we're seeing being built in California and Australia as well. So if you can kind of get this flexibility to work and make it something that people actually want to do that suits their lives, then I think that's probably the holy grail. But there is a danger that things like heat happen in isolation. Policies are decided without telling people this is going to cost you more money. We've seen the Green Homes grant the uptake of that hasn't been huge, to say the least. And so there's a bit of a disconnect there between what government and industry want to happen and what people who want to do with their homes. So that's definitely something that needs to be addressed.
Definitely, yeah. I think it's going to be a really important question over the next 10 years or so, because I guess this sort of next phase of decarbonisation is almost inevitably going to be more disruptive, or at least it looks like it will be. We have had another question which I think is maybe quite important, and perhaps Julia, you'd like to deal with. How much diversity of supply is needed to support and secure the economy whilst driving down carbon? That's from Bob Tarrant. So I guess, is there sort of an advantage in having a mix of different generators, or is it a case that maybe there's one generation form that's better than the rest and we should just go 100% for that?
I think that diversity is a great thing in almost all areas, including in electricity generation. I think that, as well as not wanting to have too much dependence on weather patterns, which do tend to commonality across quite a lot of Northern Europe, I think that we also need to take into account land use. So again, we need a diverse source of electricity generation. So offshore wind, great, but we don't want offshore wind generation to the point at which it's actually problematic for marine life and shipping lanes and so on. Likewise, nuclear is very dense, but there aren't that many places where you can put nuclear in the UK, particularly big nuclear. So there's an inherent limit on how much of it it's sensible to build. So I absolutely think that diversity is where it's at.
Yeah, Kirsty, are you able to, do you have any facts on the tip of your tongue about how much nuclear you can produce relative to, say, a great big wind farm or something like that in acreage?
I actually,
I put you on the spot.
I actually do have something like that, funnily enough. And I think, but I agree with Julia's point that actually, the scale of the net zero transition is so large that we really should be seeking to deploy as many different technologies as possible to as great an extent as is feasible and achievable and acceptable, and balancing, other other interests like marine life and biodiversity and so on. So we've got two kind of controversial projects at the moment that have generated some controversy. Cleve Hill Solar Farm, which is the largest one that we will build in the UK, and then Sizewell C, which is also undergoing consultation with the public as well. If we wanted to, if we decided not to build Sizewell C, we would have to build 76 of those Cleve Hill solar farms to replace the equivalent energy output from Sizewell C. That's an area of 295 square kilometres to replace Sizewell, which is an area of 0.32 square kilometres. So that's I know it's a little sort of number wang, like throwing out these big numbers, 295 square kilometres. It's a big chunk of land, so really thinking about land use is incredibly important, and thinking about how, we of course want to see our lion's share of electricity generation coming from offshore wind. We shouldn't be double counting that area of offshore for producing hydrogen as well. So, we should be thinking about complementary pathways that aren't competing with each other, but that are taking into account those kinds of constraints.
Excellent, thank you. And hopefully that answers your question, Bob. So Julia, maybe just coming back to you as well. One thing which we touched upon is obviously the costs and potential costs of kind of transitioning towards this greener future. And this is something which maybe detractors of nuclear power would be keen to capitalise on and sort of talk about a lot more relative to other forms of generation. So is there anything you think the government could be doing to help the nuclear industry to bring down costs? Different financing models, perhaps, which we talked about in our CPS report, but maybe for those who are watching who aren't so familiar, you can maybe talk them through that and how they might be able to help lower the cost of nuclear generation.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, the first thing to say is that the nuclear industry itself absolutely has to bring down cost, and that's an accepted precursor to anything I say around how can the government help. But the government can help in two particular ways. The first thing is actually program. You need a program. Offshore wind has made its admirable reductions in cost as against a clear program. And so it's in repeating things that you do them better and more cheaply. We can already see the cost trajectory between Unit 1 of Hinkley and Unit 2 of Hinkley. Some things are being done up to 40% faster just because we've learned. So what we're really keen to do with Sizewell is to get it going in a time frame in which the experienced supply chain can move across and use the same design. And when we say design, I mean, I'm not an engineer myself. People often don't understand the layers of design. We mean literally down to the contractor method statements. So literally down to the way they lift stuff, the way they put in a piece of steel. We want to use as much of the same stuff as we can. That is the basic magic of how you get down the capital costs. But then, as you referred to, Eamon, the cost of financing for nuclear are very significant. This is a widely known figure that in the £92.50 Hinkley strike price, £11 is the cost of construction. So this is not to diminish the importance of us getting down the cost of construction. We must and we will, and it's programme that we need above all to do it, and repeated design, fleet build. But the cost of financing is critical to nuclear because of its long construction period. And so, as the NEO suggested, and as people on in this meeting will know, the government is looking at the regulated asset-based model as the best way of getting down the cost to consumers. And I think that the really important thing for people to remember, even above the relative cost of financing and capital cost for nuclear, is that what consumers care about is their electricity bill. So people outside the world of essentially media comparator are not focused on this is the cost of offshore wind in my electricity bill, and this is the cost of nuclear in my electricity bill, and this is the cost of transmission in my electricity bill. They're focused on the cost of their electricity bill. And building nuclear will bring down the cost of your electricity bill, because the alternative to building nuclear is building vast quantities of storage, which today is more expensive and is forecast in base modelling to be more expensive than building nuclear for some considerable period of time. So I think that capital cost programme financing, get the cost of the money down as low as we can, but also helping people understand that this sort of focus as though they're in competition in particular between wind and nuclear is just not answering the point. The point is, how can we help reduce bills for people as we progress further and further into net zero?
Thank you. Yeah, and Rachel, I don't know if you've anything to add on this. Maybe any sort of perspectives you've kind of picked up through your day job, and maybe kind of oppositional perspectives. How do you think this sort of all plays out in the politics of it all? The government, will it proceed with the sort of the RAB model, where that sort of financing mechanism? How is there going to be any opposition to that? I mean, I think some people would say, at least from sort of a broadly free marketing perspective, that's government intervention. Maybe that's to be eschewed. And again, the sort of government seems to be a bit more, open to taking some of these decisions. How do you think that sort of all plays out in Westminster and beyond?
I think clearly this is the most controversial part of building nuclear. It is a huge cost, and I think Julia rightly acknowledged that the construction risks are big, investors don't like them, but it's a lot for a company to shoulder, which is why we sort of saw that high strike price for Hinkley. And the government said that it won't do the same again. So finding the alternative has proved really difficult. And we've heard kind of behind the scenes that there's been a lot of back and forth within government about the RAB model, RAB Plus, which involves, some other private capital investment as well as the government, and trying to bring in private investment into a kind of EDF government private capital model is tremendously difficult. And who the investors, what kind of investor that will be, who has the deep enough pockets, but I think that's really what's holding back the development of new plants. We see it's a really long, protracted process, as it should be. We shouldn't just sign them off, but the thought that we've got quite a long way to go with Sizewell in terms of taking, when EDF takes the final investment decision, then thinking about, okay, maybe we still need one more station. We saw with Wilver that has, been completely shelved, that they really tried to cling on to that for so long to try to get something built there. But in the end, it was the financing that meant that project just didn't work. The site was good. That's what everyone in the industry says. It's a great site. Something will happen there. But, they weren't able to get a big station financed. And that's even with a very generous offer from the government. So I think what happens, obviously, me and the rest of the media are all very interested to know how this is going to play out. So I think that will be the key to what will happen with future stations being built.
Julia, I don't know if you just want to pick up on anything quickly there.
Yeah, I'd say that the reason I think that Sizewell will be financed with private capital, and EDF's declared intention is to be a minority shareholder. So the hope is that this is actually majority owned by financial investors, and to the extent possible, we hope British pension funds. It's because Sizewell is a next of a kind, so the intrinsic construction risk comes down. It's effectively Unit 3 of Hinkley. So the intrinsic risk comes down to the point where you can introduce an investment grade financing model, at which point a very long-term inflation-linked stable asset. They've got a great performance record, nuclear power stations, of chugging out power for a very long-term period. Actually, and in a world in which it's acknowledged that building nuclear actually brings costs down for consumers, it's otherwise a very ESG friendly investment. It's got a fantastic social record of levelling up, taking in apprentices, turning out managing directors of the stations and so on. So it's actually a very attractive investment, provided that everybody can get happy with an investment grade income model.
I'm going to turn to a question from the floor, and maybe Kirsty, you can have a first stab at this one. Essentially, I think they're asking, are there any regulations around nuclear power stations and nuclear energy generation which could be looking to reform, update, not necessarily get rid of entirely, but yeah, kind of modernize, given that nuclear power has been around since 1956 in the UK? I'm not sure. Is it kind of incumbent upon us to now, especially with the new reactor designs coming online, to sort of look at our nuclear regulatory handbook?
Sure, yes. Before I would comment on that, I just cannot resist saying something about this financing question, because the offshore wind industry has really demonstrated how sustained access to finance and continuous build in exchange for a determined commitment to cost reduction and increased deployment really is a successful formula that drives performance improvements and increased competitiveness. Now, we have a lot of real world evidence, from existing programs in the world, around the world today, in China, Korea, UAE, and other places, Japan, to show that this is a winning formula, regardless of the country, regardless of the technology, and in historical programs of build as well. The average cost of nuclear new build in the world today is less than $4,000 a kilowatt. And, I've seen on the record Sizewell C indications that given the right financing mechanism, price to the consumer of around £40 per megawatt hour is entirely achievable with that sort of demonstrated license design and an experienced team delivering it. So, this idea that nuclear energy is expensive really isn't supported by the evidence. Now, in terms of modernization of regulations, two things. Firstly, more broadly, a new net zero duty for environmental and safety regulators would be, a very important step in order to ensure that climate mitigation potential is properly weighed against other environmental impacts. So that's something that I believe is going to benefit, all clean energy infrastructure across the board, and it should be under consideration in the UK to ensure that important clean energy projects aren't refused permission. And they have massive climate mitigation potential. And then secondly, we're seeing in the United States, for example, really important and interesting changes to the regulatory system as regards to new technologies, microreactors and new advanced reactors that don't have emergency planning zones beyond the site boundary, for example. So we're starting to see regulators responding to new safety systems that are coming through with advanced reactors, and we'd expect to see the ONR responding accordingly in the UK as well.
Very interesting. I don't know if Julia or Rachel, you have anything else to sort of chip in on there?
I think that as Kirsty said, finding the right balance between environmental regulation and the need to build infrastructure for net zero is really important as we sort of move out of our European Union directives and into our own domestic system.
Perfect. Another question we've had, kind of something you also mentioned in your opening remarks, Julia, was all around sort of the skills necessary to constructing sort of new nuclear sites and associated infrastructure, and perhaps sort of within that, what that might mean in terms of the government's hallowed levelling up agenda, which I think we've managed to get all the way through this event without saying, which is quite amazing. What I guess maybe for you and maybe Rachel, do you think this the government's kind of keen to capitalise on how this complements its levelling up agenda, and is that a good thing to do? Is that a bad thing to do? Is it just sort of something that's happening anyway? Any thoughts there?
I think it's a very good thing to do. I think that we have huge focus on increasing UK content from an already high base. We have really fantastic UK content, and we'll have 1,500 apprentices, and people can have really long-term careers. I think, as I said, but the managing director of Hinkley and a lot of the rest of the top team, the people who run the Sizewell B station, they started as 16-year-old apprentices. and they become managing directors. Nuclear can offer people fantastic careers, and it is levelling up in action, really. And so we're very keen to do as much of that as we can. And there'll be a lot of jobs, obviously, in the east of England near the power station, but actually the jobs for nuclear are quite well spread through the UK, with a lot of manufacturing, particularly in Wales and in the north of England. So definitely the levelling up agenda, I think, is really important to the way that we build our net zero infrastructure.
Rachel, I don't know if do you sort of share that? Do you think it's important? Should we be kind of attaching kind of jobs figures to every green announcement, or is it sort of something that that happens and we should celebrate it, but it shouldn't necessarily be the operative kind of metric?
I think clearly that's been a real priority for government, to make sure that every announcement has jobs front and centre, and we've really noticed that nothing gets through unless it has that jobs aspect to it, which is hugely important. I mean, we need to create industry in the UK and jobs, and I mean, we all keep saying how great we are at offshore wind, but that really is an industry that the UK is leading in, and you don't want to have to import skills from other countries, and we want to have people here that are experts that we can export to other places. And I think that has been, the numbers look great, but there is a difference between jobs on a piece of paper and when they actually happen and when they come. And it's a very interesting topic about sort of green and we call them brown jobs that are connected to, say, coal and gas, and whether how many you can convert directly, whether you can skill people, or whether they need to be new people, because I think it's something that graduates will be interested in, whether you can go from being 50 and working at a coal station that's closing and then reskilling. That's really interesting, and there's quite a lot of examples in the US where they are successfully moving people from brown jobs to green jobs, because obviously you don't want to make a whole section of the industry unemployed while saying, oh, look how many jobs we're creating. You need to have a sort of net number to properly compare it, which we're kind of yet to see. These jobs are all kind of they're not actually happening yet.
Yeah, and I guess kind of doubly important as we sort of hopefully venture from the clouds of the coronavirus economic pandemic as well. Well, according to my clock, that is our time for today. I'd just like to say thank you to Rachel, to Julia, and to Kirsty, and also to the Minister, Anne-Marie Trevelyan, for speaking to us earlier. I should also say that you can sign up to our CPS and CapEx newsletters. You can follow us on Twitter and on Facebook, and there will be a recording of this event available on our YouTube channel shortly. So thank you for tuning in. I hope you've enjoyed yourself and had a good time.